This week, Paul and I discuss bug bounty programs. In the news, Lenovo reveals ThinkPad devices are affected by two CVSS 10 vulnerabilities from September of 2017. The death and resurrection of GitHub accounts will be the doom of us all. And this is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with the gentle hum of Bitcoin miners. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library, on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome everyone to episode 6, our 7th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I am excited to be joined by my perspicacious co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Keith. It's good to be here. Excited, as always, for our all of our shows, and Application Security Weekly is the latest addition to the Security Weekly podcast network. It's going to be a lot of fun, as always. Love talking about AppSec.
Yeah, it's always a good time, and I know that this week we're going to be talking about a hot topic that's near and dear to my heart, being bug bounty programs. Before we do that, Paul, do we want to do any announcements at all at this point?
Yeah, there's announcements. I guess.
How about I start with them and then I'll let you jump in. So first and foremost, I want to recommend that everybody check out the Security Weekly on-demand material because, quite frankly, it's awesome and it's got a lot of really great content. So you can get some stuff from Cybereason, Onapsis, Signal Sciences, Black Hills Information Security, Stealth Bits, and more available at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Check it out. I've enjoyed it and you will too.
Awesome. We're doing a few conferences, so there's going to be InfoSec World, Secure World, and I thought there was another one. Hack West. Hack West is thrown in there too. So we're working on actually building an events page so we can just list out. Source Boston is the other one. So we can just list out all the conferences that we are running discount codes for our listeners in addition to ones that we'll be at. So hopefully by next week we'll have that landing page up, and then we can just tell people to go to securityweekly.com/events. That doesn't exist yet, but it will, and then you'll be able to get all the information about events that we, like I said, will either be at or supporting in some fashion. So.
Awesome. And one last shout out as well. If you work in IT and you have access to, or you want access rather, to an awesome library of on-demand training, head over to itpro.tv/securityweekly. So they are now accepting requests for demos of the IT team solution that allows you and your coworkers to access over 3,300 hours of training at any time. Use the code SECWeekly30 for a 7-day free trial and 30% off.
Awesome.
And I just want to say, Paul, I've really enjoyed the IT Pro TV stuff. I mean, from everything I've been watching so far on Vue.js, it's different than anything I've taken from a training perspective because you actually get to like see the people and then they jump into the code and they have kind of this ongoing dialogue. It's not all that different from maybe watching our podcast. So I think it's a pretty cool tool and something that everybody should check out.
Yeah, oh no, that's awesome. Yeah, our setups are similar. They have a little more advanced technology to support that training and learning environment that you talked about, Keith, but it is very similar. We're Security Weekly and IT Pro TV are very much in alignment with the way that we produce and distribute or let people consume the content. So it's awesome. So we're going to talk bug bounties.
Yeah. Well, so full disclosure right out at the very front, I want to say I do work for BugCrowd, which was the first bug bounty platform to be incorporated of course, following on after the bug bounty programs from the likes of Microsoft and Google. So that's kind of my full disclosure out front, is that I do have a vested interest in this. But given the recent events, especially the the Senate testimony that took place last week from a number of individuals, including Katie Massoris, our good friend of the show, as well as the new Chief Information Security Officer at Uber, John Flynn, Martin Mikos, who's the CEO of HackerOne, which is a competitor to BugCrowd, and Justin Brookman, who's a Consumer Union Director of Privacy and Technology Policy individual. So
I just want to say that,
interesting.
Did you hear the episode where we mentioned Katie, and I just went off on this? Were you on that episode, Keith, when it kind of went off on how much I really like Katie's hair? Because it's just beautiful.
I wasn't on the episode, but I listened to it yesterday on my ride down into Boston. And so I was thinking to myself, Katie's hair is really impressive, but she's done a number of really amazing things for the industry as a whole. I mean, including, of course, starting off with the bug bounty program at Microsoft to kind of, lay the groundwork for these sort of things to happen. But yes, I do remember and recall you going off about Katie's hair. And quite frankly, for you and I, who have very little hair, I can see why we'd be jealous.
Yeah, I'm a little envious. I am. I think I said that in the episode, and it was kind of creepy how much I talked about Katie's hair. So, Katie, I apologize.
Well, so she was also actually on another podcast that just went live yesterday as well, where she talked a little bit about her congressional testimony as well. And what I found really interesting about the whole testimony was mostly how much John Flynn, so the CISO at Uber, really owned the fact that Uber was in the wrong for doing this. And he's the new CISO, right? Like, he's not even the guy that was responsible for any of this happening, but he basically went to Congress and gave, as I think it was called, the best mea culpa that anyone's ever seen, really.
Well, I mean, the fact that they have to apologize is somewhat of an issue as well. However, it is encouraging to see that they, are turning things around. The other thing that really impressed me about Uber recently, somewhat not related to bug bounties, but have you ever looked at Uber's GitHub repository?
Not as of yet. I did have a tool that I think we talked about last week that was pretty cool in the show notes about some streaming like data science technology that they open sourced, which was pretty awesome.
There's got to be a couple of dozen projects that are completely open source in their GitHub repository on various things, some of which are security related, some are application and testing and performance related. I thought it was really cool that Uber, being a large company as they are, which does a lot of sharing, and I don't think many people knew that. And I thought, this show was a great opportunity to kind of mention that. It came up because Chris Gates is working on a project called Meta, which implements the MITRE ATT&CK framework and is a tool to help you with that. So it was pretty cool.
That is actually really awesome. And quite frankly, I'm going to have to go check it out now, because the tool that I saw last week for analyzing streaming data, which is something that they use for obviously rides, like actually analyzing different rides and routes, etc., live in their app. Being able to take that sort of ability and then turn it around and use it in maybe your own data that is a streaming across the wire sort of thing for analytics purposes. Doing that live as it's streaming is hard. And I was really enthused by that they open sourced their tooling for that. So definitely check that out on their GitHub. Back to kind of the reason why this congressional hearing took place, though, was for those that aren't in the know, 2 years ago in 2016, there was a breach of Uber data that is pertaining to 57 million users in total, which included both drivers and riders. And 25 million of those affected were users from the United States. So that breach has been in the news quite a bit because of the fact that what happened shortly after, and I would say basically right after the breach occurred, a researcher, and I would say they're a rogue researcher, not necessarily like a bug bounty hunter, came forward to Uber through side channels. Basically, it was via email, and notified them of the vulnerability, but also then said, I have all of this data and I want $100,000. That was very clearly extortion, right? Like, there's no doubt about the fact that they were trying to get as much money out of them as possible. And ultimately what ended up happening was Uber leveraged their bug bounty program on HackerOne to pay out that bounty, I believe in the form of Bitcoin at the time. That's at least what has been reported. And as a result of it, there has been some controversy and conflagration around the idea of bug bounties, really where they fit in the market, as well as really what they are. And in this case, Uber has come forward and said this was extortion. We recognize it as extortion now, and we should not have treated it as a bug bounty. And as someone who works for a bug bounty company, I would definitely agree with that sentiment. Because that sets the wrong tone for what a bug bounty is intended to do. It's not intended to pay for breaches as cover up. It's intended to help you find your vulnerabilities through manual testing from other users out on the internet. And then, of course, pay those researchers for their time, for their findings accordingly. Paul, I want to let you jump in to see if you have any questions. Of course, I don't want to drive too much of this conversation from the perspective of what my experience is and kind of my vested interest, but I want to make sure that we're answering any questions that you might have as a general user.
Yeah, I think actually the story we're covering on Paul Security Weekly with Katie Mazuras was talking about the place and the role that bug bounties play in organizations, and how an over-reliance on bug bounties is certainly a bad thing. But I think over time, as we've talked about what security programs and security architecture looks like, there's never been, well, people have tried to put together a list of like, hey, you should do these things, or, hey, you should do this, and it allows you not to do these other things. Like, everything has its place. And bug bounties, I believe, play a very critical role in your security program. However, not having one or relying on them too much is a bad thing. But kind of like that happy medium where, yeah, you know what, it's good, we're going to set aside, X amount of budget that, we've calculated is the appropriate amount for our strategy and for our business. And we're going to enable researchers to basically go find heinous vulnerabilities in our stuff so that we can fix them. It's a model that works, that I believe will work from now to the end of time. And I think when people look at newer strategies and or solutions, they think of it as replacing something when really it's an addition or just a very nice part of your overall security program that allows you to reduce risk. And I believe it certainly does that. I also think it has some ancillary benefits of keeping some of your vulnerabilities and the potential exploits for those out of the black market, because you're creating your own market for that. So I'm sure it's still going to happen, but you're giving people a path to be able to do that, which is different from a company like Zerodium. And I don't know if you've looked into this particular company, Keith, but it sounds like it's almost like a legitimate gray market, if you will. Like, it kind of sits between the black market and the legitimate market, which is just kind of concerning to me, because are they notifying the company to fix the breach, or are they just selling you're just selling their exploit and they're selling it to governments across the world? That's kind of shady to me.
And I believe it's Choki Bekrar who actually runs Zerodium. But yeah, I have looked into them. And as an organization, they basically will buy exploits and vulnerability data from researchers to then turn that around and sell that to government agencies for use in their intelligence tool sets. So it is a very different market from what is considered a bug bounty. But yeah, there are people that will pay handsome sums of money for certain sets of vulnerabilities because of the difficult nature that exists in terms of just finding and leveraging them, right? It's interesting to me because with bug bounties, so last week when I was in San Francisco for company kickoff at BugCrowd, there was an individual that's a customer of BugCrowd that came in and he said, the reason that people have bug bounties and the reason that I think it's effective is, quite frankly, as you pointed out, bad guys have a way to monetize your data. It's just not through you. Whereas bug bounties, it's very much a white hat market. The people that I know and I am good friends with are pen testers by day. They're application security folks. They're developers, right? They're security architects. They're people that almost like the idea of, you have someone that goes and drives Uber on the weekends as a side gig. Well, this is literally a side gig for security professionals all over the world. And it's incredibly effective for them because it allows them to practice and enhance their skill sets while also allowing the companies to benefit from that diversified testing that's usually on an ongoing basis, right? So the thing that I think is important to differentiate as well, because Katie on another podcast was talking about how we've had the ability to have human testing for a very long time in the form of pen tests. And I definitely agree that pen tests have a place in the entire ecosystem of security for an enterprise. But to the extent that, and this has happened to me on a number of occasions, many of the pen testers I know are very, very good at network-based, operating system-based, systems-based testing, right? Like they're very good at finding AD credentials, for example. If we went to talk to Larry, he would be very, very good at getting access to domain controllers and then leveraging and moving around inside of a network. Many of the people that have a very strong skill set in that regard that I've met personally and actually trained at DerbyCon have things like their OSCP, but don't know the first thing about AppSec, which is quite frankly the huge footprint that everybody's ignoring. Because
and one reason why we created this show,
right? Exactly, right. Hence, we are here. So it's interesting to me that Katie felt that pen testing really was the way for manual testing to have taken place in the past, whereas I know that the diversified skill sets of bug bounties really make a difference for a lot of companies, because they don't just get one or two testers. They get as many as hundreds or thousands of testers potentially looking at their application.
And so, I think I slightly disagree with the skill set as you've kind of laid it out. I think that many pen testers, many more than you might have alluded to, Keith, do either understand the application to a certain extent, or with a little bit of practice and research can learn enough to be effective at finding vulnerabilities inside of applications. However, when you look at the network, it's just a different network and endpoints and things like that, in Active Directory or even Linux. If you understand enough about the operating system, you can use some tried and true ways to get in and gain a foothold in the organization, and then potentially compromise the application. And that's just one path. I truly believe that as that path starts to close down, of course, Active Directory has been a great way for so-called network or infrastructure level kind of testing to be very successful. As that starts to get more and more locked down, it starts to push into the application. But then it's a different problem. It's just a completely different beast, because you've got Active Directory in like one base operating system. If you're a really large organization that you've got 50,000 employees or more or less, let's say, you likely have hundreds, maybe 1,000 different applications. And all of those different applications are grouped into different architectures, different technologies that you then have to understand, and they're customized for each one. So the amount of effort it would take to do a similar kind of test against all of the applications, you'd need just massive teams of people looking at all of that. And I think that's one problem that bug bounties solve. An aspect of that problem is allowing more people to look at your applications. The manual testers can only look at so many different applications. And so it creates this problem of manual testing being extremely difficult across those apps. But I do think that that's where it's going. And last time we were talking about some mainframe security. Well, I think that's important. I also think that the applications that run on top of those mainframes are somewhat of a even greater risk than the platform itself.
For sure. And quite frankly, even for the pen testers that I have met that don't fully grasp or have their arms around application security, I would say they are primed to learn it quickly, right?
Sure.
A number of people that I trained at DerbyCon last year had their OSCP, and I was like, oh, wow, I am training people with their OSCP. I really felt very humbled, because that to me is the gold standard, or one of the gold standards of certifications in our industry, right? And to be training those people in application security where they had never really dabbled in it before was a lot of fun, because they picked up on it very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And to that end, the other thing that you point to, and this is really where bug bounties solve a bigger problem, is if you have a pen tester who's really good at, say, Postgres database queries, for example, they understand Postgres front to back. They can do SQL injection against the Postgres database. But if your application is using NoSQL in some fashion, so MongoDB as a great
Hmm.
example here, that's an entirely different animal in and of itself because now the injection vectors are very, very different. And that may or may not be a skill set that the pen tester you have hired actually has. And that's where I think bug bounties come in and make a really big difference is you get all of the skill sets, right? You get that person that is really good at Postgres and SQL injection from that perspective. You get the person that is really good at NoSQL injection and auth bypass, and on and on. And I think that that's that kind of wisdom of the crowd is really where the differentiator is, as opposed to pen tests, which are incredibly useful and important because let's face it, phishing is a very real problem, and your internal network security is paramount to your ability to do your job, right? And for your business to keep those crown jewels safe. What is interesting to me is the crown jewels for most companies today is actually shifting more and more to a web presence of some form. So a great example is Equifax, right? Like their data that is their crown jewels as an organization was accessible via a web front end, and that's where the application security aspect starts to come into play here.
Yeah, I think that there's multiple levels of testing, and I think that your traditional penetration testers can be uh, pretty effective, even if like I even think about when I was doing pen testing full time. I'd come across all kinds of different applications, and they were in scope in varying capacities. While I wasn't getting paid to test just that application, you work with the client and say, well, I found this thing. Like, do you want me to just take a look at it and see what I can find? And sometimes it was like a cold fusion. Now, I've never developed in cold fusion in my entire life. It's kind of a train wreck of a technology, to be quite honest with you. I'm pretty sure that kind of sums it up. But just knowing what you know about testing the security of things, you can do a good job in testing that application in a short period of time. Now, what you're not going to get from pen testing that you get from bug bounties or maybe some crowdsourced assessment services is a deeper dive into some of those individual applications. And that's important too. And that's why I think all these technologies, when we look at assessing your security, all of these play in nicely. And so you would have a bug bounty program. Maybe you would do some crowdsourced style pen testing across your environment. Maybe you have an internal pen test team. You're going to hire some external penetration testers, and you're going to run some attack simulations as well. And using all of those effectively across your environment. Now, not every organization is going to need all and have the requirement to maximize your return on investment for all of those services, but all of those are tools that are available to you, and they can play together nicely. And depending on your organization, you're going to want to choose some or all of those to be part of your security program.
For sure, for sure. And I think that the last thing that we can say on this, because I want to make sure we get to the learning and tool section, because this is one of my favorite things to talk about when we get to that, is the fact that Katie pointed out, if your bug bounty is your end all be all security presence or
Yeah.
your security program, it's probably bad for you as an organization. And for the most part, I would agree. I mean, you really should be doing the internal pen tests. You should be doing the external network level pen tests. But in addition to that, and I think what Katie's point was really driving at is you actually have to have a development team that has the bandwidth built into their sprints to address the problems that are found. You
Yeah.
actually have to plan for building an architecture that is resilient to change because you're going to need to change with the bugs that are found. So I think that that's largely what her company, Luda Security, actually does, is actually prepare companies for basically taking in all of that information and then using it effectively, that it's not disruptive to the way in which they do business, which is what she did at Microsoft, quite frankly.
Correct. Sorry, I can't think straight today. I was going to say something and I don't remember what it was.
Quite all right, quite all right. So I know that we're getting ready here for a break, but before we do, I actually wanted to opine a little bit on what has really become my absolute favorite editor, which is Visual Studio Code. Now, for the most part, I generally don't use Microsoft products. It's nothing against Microsoft personally. I just have not had the greatest experience with a lot of their different product lines. And so I was hesitant to start using Visual Studio Code. At the time, I was using PyCharm,
Hmm.
and I think before that, I was also using WebStorm. So
Yeah, our
to
developers here go back and forth, I think, between PyCharm and Visual Studio.
yeah, and so honestly, for me, I was paying for PyCharm on the I think it was like monthly subscription, and I had already used Atom and Sublime. Sometimes I
Yep.
had actually programmed in Vim. Believe it or not, I just had a nice color scheme and everything and some
I do,
plugins.
and that's what I
And
use. I use Vim for all of my programming and editing tasks, and I can't seem to latch on to any other editor. And I know that some of the other editors, or most of them anyway, will have like a VI emulation mode, and it seems just kind of fake to me. Like it
yep.
doesn't behave quite the same way as your traditional Vim, and that's where I've been using Vim for 20 years now, so it's hard to, when I edit something, not use all of the functionality and keystrokes that I know and love in Vim. So
Well, that is where I think Visual Studio Code for me actually really made a difference. So, one of the things that is a huge bonus to Visual Studio Code over any other editor that I've used is the extensions tool sets that they have. So, I actually use a Vim extension that
mhm.
gives me all of the basically keystroke functionality that you get in Vim, like literally colon right quit, like works. It'll literally shut the
Mm.
file for you and save it.
I'll have to give that.
Like
I'll have to give that a shot because I don't think I've played with that specifically, or if I did, not recently. So
Yeah. So to that end as well, I mean, the built-in integrations with Git are phenomenal.
mm.
Especially, I use a MacBook Pro, and I really love that piece of it. IntelliSense from like the auto completion perspective is just amazing. And so, quite frankly, it's free. It's I believe it's open source. It's open on every operating system under the sun, from Linux to Mac to Windows. And I would say this, and kind of in closing about Visual Studio Code. I've written a lot of code, and this made developing code fun, which is not always the case, as I imagine you've probably also experienced, Paul.
well, just varying. I guess it depends on your definition of fun. I think some of the like or perceptions that I had of Visual Studio was Visual Basic. Did it like come from the like when you developed Visual Basic like a long time ago? Because I'm
Yeah,
old.
yeah,
Was
yeah.
that
There was
Visual?
like the Visual Basic
Was that
editor or something like
yeah?
that,
Was that done in
and
like
that's
Visual Studio? Is that like the same thing that we're talking? It's different today, right? But that's kind of where like my brain goes when you say Visual Studio. I think about when you're developing Access databases or writing Visual Basic, 15 or 20 years ago, that's what you used, and those tools were pretty horrible. But now it sounds like it's still a Microsoft product, but it's a general developer tool set that runs on Windows, Mac, and OS 10. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So basically, the way that I would define it
Wait,
is
did I say Windows,
VS.
Mac, and OS 10? Windows, Linux, and OS 10. Good Lord.
Yes, Mac OS.
Mac
So
OS, and it's not
yeah,
even
I mean,
OS 10, it's Mac OS. God damn it.
that's why I'm here, Paul. It's okay. Um, so I would say this. It's usually referred to as VS Code. So Visual Studio is still like your compiled down type editor for a lot of Java, C, C++ editing. But VS Code, or Visual Studio Code, is kind of like a rethinking of that is free and open source.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's built on Electron, which is basically what GitHub used to make, I think it was Atom, as well as Slack is kind of written in the same type of
Sure.
language. So my strongest and thorough recommendation is check it out, add some plugins. If you have questions, I am hoodie@securityweekly.com. Just send me an email. I will tell you all of the extensions that I love to use, and we can definitely get you rolling on VS Code, because I think, quite frankly, our listeners are going to love it if they haven't tried it.
Awesome.
All right, with that, I guess we'll take a break and we will come back with the news.
Awesome. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. This is the news for episode 6. So, Paul, I know that we were just kind of talking a little bit about different operating systems, and I'm sure you probably are somewhat glad you're not on a MacBook, because it turns out that Mac apps, even if they're sandboxed, can record your screen at any time without you knowing.
That's interesting. I hadn't seen this story. Is this did this break just yesterday, or did I probably just missed it?
It is recent. It is like some news that a researcher had looked into and had actually tested. This is actually linked directly to their site from Felix Kraus. And basically what he found was that you can actually go ahead and use the CG window list create image functionality inside of an application, even if it's sandboxed, which means as a sandbox, it should only be able to access its own memory space, its own functionality, and maybe make some calls down to the operating system to actually allow it to maybe do networking level stuff, right? Like being able to reach out to the web if it needs to grab a extension, for example. But otherwise, that it shouldn't be able to access operating system level requests or commands. And as it turns out, using the CG window list create image functionality, you can not only take screenshots of your Mac silently without any kind of sound or knowledge, but it can also access every pixel, even if the Mac app is in the background. It can use basic OCR software to read the text on the screen, and it can access all monitors that are connected to the MacBook.
Wow.
Which in my mind is like, that is just straight fire. And I don't know if this is on just High Sierra, if this is on all versions. From what I could tell, it looked like it was all versions. But again, this is just one of those things where, yet again, real bad.
Sounds like a feature. Screenshots for everyone.
Considered a feature at some point, right? I mean, like, if you think about it, like, how does this sort of thing come about? And it probably has something to do with a lot of the checks that take place in the CG window list create image library that should otherwise check, is this a sandboxed application or not? Or does this process have the right to make this request? And I imagine that it was probably one of those things buried deep in the code base that is probably been around for a while. It would be my guess, just given what it sounds like it can do. And it was probably the basis for a lot of the screenshot or even the snapshot functionality that you're allowed to use today. So I'll be really interested to see if they end up fixing this, or if they end up making any sort of changes to that library. If they do, I doubt we will actually hear anything loud about it, because Apple tends to be pretty quiet about these kind of bug fixes.
Interesting.
From there, Paul, I know that last year you covered I think it was the Blueborn vulnerability, which is what is related to, I believe, here for Lenovo. So that was I believe at that point, like a Wi-Fi Bluetooth level vulnerability that allowed some sort of, I think it was remote code execution or some sort of like bypass access to devices. And as it turns out, Lenovo has revealed that its Wi-Fi chipset is actually vulnerable to CVE 2017 11.120 and 11.121, which are patched by both Apple and Google in September. And as it appears, is now also in the Broadcom wireless LAN drivers for Lenovo. Now we're like, what, 4 months, 5 months since that came out? I'm surprised it has taken them so long to figure out that they were vulnerable to this. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I that's really puzzling. Do you think Broadcom gives access to the source code to Google, Apple, and Lenovo so that they can integrated into their systems, or are they just giving them a binary blob?
That's a really good question. And my guess would be they are probably either giving them a binary blob or they're using some sort of like, here is the API documentation that you can use to make requests of the chipset without giving them the underlying code, right? Like that would be my guess. Now, Google and Apple, of course, I feel like are probably much larger companies than Lenovo. So they might actually have access to the source code based on the fact that, they're the 800-pound gorillas in the room. They can throw their weight around. Lenovo goes and asks for that. I doubt that they are given that sort of kind of play when it comes to, yeah, you're Lenovo. We deal with HP and Dell and all these other companies too. So here's the API. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Broadcom's been not willing to play ball with their drivers. The wireless chipsets on like Linksys routers back in the day when Larry and I wrote the book, largely, I believe, were Broadcom. And that was an issue because nobody had the source code. And all of the efforts were like reverse engineering their drivers to make their Wi-Fi cards work. And that was just a train wreck. And then the issue that arises is when you get a binary blob, let's say then you've got to update your kernel to your firmware, and it's not compatible with the binary blob. So because you have to recompile the driver to work with the latest kernel, and you can't do that because you don't have the source code. So you have to wait for Broadcom to release a new version of the driver. So running on the assumption that it is a binary blob, Lenovo should have seen this and fixed it a long time ago. Conceivably, Broadcom probably issued a new binary blob. Maybe they were testing it. Maybe they knew about it. I mean, who knows? This is an area that I've dealt with, again, when we were researching wireless routers, and you want to put open source firmware and software on your wireless router, but the wireless chipset is proprietary and has a proprietary driver. And that's why some model of routers, you can't actually do that because you don't have enough of the pieces to be able to integrate their proprietary drivers into your code.
And what's interesting about specifically this situation is Lenovo initially had a list of ThinkPads that were vulnerable to the Broadcom wireless LAN driver vulnerabilities in Windows 10. It looks like they've actually expanded that list with over 24 ThinkPads that use the Broadcom BCM4356 wireless LAN driver. So it makes me also wonder too, Paul, how much of this is like an inventory problem, right? So they didn't necessarily check other assets that they've sold in the recent past for the vulnerability. Maybe they just hit the critical ones first and they're now doing some due diligence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. If you want to learn more, you can actually Google for BCM 4356 and look at all the people that have been looking at it. Like there's a post on an Ubuntu forum. It says, hey, I got a Lenovo with this, chipset. How do I get it working? It looks like there is some Linux kernel source code that was developed, but again, that could be something that someone reverse engineered the binary blob and tried to recreate the drivers. Those tend to be somewhat problematic. So yeah, I think it's interesting wireless drivers have always been something that is pretty fascinating and something that my take on it is it's not really easy code to write either and keep vulnerabilities out of. So
for sure. And quite frankly, I mean, the other interesting side of this is, as you and I both know, Linux and wireless has not always played well. So
it's gotten better over the years.
Specific to Windows 10. Yeah,
Larry is and Josh Wright keep up on that a lot more than I have been. Certainly, it has gotten better, but they could fill you in on all the wireless driver. Back in the day, it was a nightmare.
Yeah, and even still, I mean, depending on the actual chipset you're using, it sounds like it can still be a nightmare, according to that Ubuntu post.
But it's interesting that I was just going to say, I do also find it interesting that Lenovo seems to have not been aware of all of their model laptops that are using BCM 4356. You think
right?
That would
that's an inventory problem, right? And that's what gets me. That's what's interesting about the whole situation is 24 additional models now going on 4 or 5 months later. Like, really?
I mean, sometimes there's different versions of the chipsets are really. We could do a whole show just on wireless chipsets, to be honest with you, because they're going to use whatever's cheapest, and then for like one model, and then like a new version of that chipset may come out, and that's a little cheaper, so we'll switch to that one, and then maybe we'll go to a totally different manufacturer. I think the primary factor behind that decision of what chipset to use is cost. Like, what can they get manufactured the cheapest? Certainly when it relates to wireless routers that you want to sell for $80 online, you know what I mean? So,
Right.
and I think it's a similar thing inside laptops.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Speaking of source code, by the way, Paul, a very interesting thing happened recently with a GitHub account related to a Go code package. So you probably remember, I think it was last year or the year before in 2016, when NPM repositories were basically broken because of a left pad JavaScript library that was removed by the actual creator. So I don't know. Do you recall that story, Paul? Do
I
you remember
don't.
how that was breaking everything?
Nope.
Okay, well,
Sorry.
that's okay. It's okay. I mean, being a developer, I was paying attention to it. So what it was is, so back in 2016, a developer, Azer Kochulu, I am probably mispronouncing the last name, they had basically written a left pad library that was used, bundled into other code sets and other frameworks, etc., inside of JavaScript. And it was basically intended to left pad your code base so that you could actually have kind of things line up appropriately when you were writing some JavaScript, specifically to Node. Similarly, what has recently happened was Jim Tun, who maintained a GitHub repository tool called Go-bin data, probably for binary data and maybe even reading binary data, was embedded for like an embedded data for Go binaries. And what ended up happening is that individual deleted their GitHub account. And as a result, for those organizations that pulled that library directly from GitHub, their products were effectively broken, right? Because they didn't actually pull that down locally and then pull it from a local library. They were pulling it straight from GitHub. The really interesting and scary situation here that happened, though, was an unidentified developer whose Go project stopped functioning as a result of the closure of that GitHub account, opened a new GitHub account under that abandoned username and repopulated it with a forked version of that package. That is just rife with possibilities for nightmares. Can you imagine if they had put in some sort of malicious package in place of it?
Well, I can, and I think that's why when we talk about software architecture that's pulling down code from Git, and I think this extends out, correct me if I'm wrong, into Docker as well, because I'm pulling down Docker images from open repositories. I don't want to just pull that stuff from Git and Docker public repositories and then automatically just put that in my production code. Because like you said, there's two issues that happen. One, there could be code in there that causes it to crash. And two, there could be security implications, vulnerabilities, and or backdoors put in there on purpose. And the strategy that I think is in wide acceptance, I'm not sure how widely adopted it is, but I think the logical thing to do is to pull down your Git repositories and pull down your Docker images, run them through a process of like almost like pre-QA, maybe even a diffing process. Like, hey, what changed since the previous version? And in an automated fashion, be able to make some assumptions, like run it through some basic security testing, run it through some basic unit testing, do some basic diffing on it, figure out what changed, and then have an approval and say, okay, yeah, now it's good to push in. Automatically detecting backdoors, probably your mileage is going to vary depending on what you're looking for. That seems to be the more accepted practice is you pull down and you do some own testing yourself before you even put that into any of your build process.
So I think that would be nice if that was the most widely adopted process out there. I don't know that it is, quite frankly. And the reason that I say that is because developers need to develop functionality, and sometimes they take shortcuts because, it's on GitHub. Therefore, we believe it's going to be reliably on GitHub and controlled by that individual. Therefore, we're going to be okay with just pulling it straight from GitHub. What is interesting is kind of two things, which is first, putting code signing in so that you can guarantee that the source that is producing the code is in fact the source that has been producing the code from the get-go. And then also, like you've kind of given hint to, is like file integrity checking, making sure that the things that are coming through are in fact, checking out from a testing perspective as well. So The thing that really want to highlight on here is that GitHub's like user account creation abilities, the ability to recreate a dead account, to me is just really, really bad handling of user registration and user access.
Yeah,
That is, I
typically,
think,
like
the most important thing here.
if I delete an account, I'm not sure how this is handled by all the different providers. I know in some circumstances, like that's basically blacklisted forever. Like I'd say
Yeah,
it's done. Like if
that's
I
best
create an
practice.
account with a name and then I delete it, like that's it. I've used up that namespace. It'd be interesting to have someone on from, like a large company like Twitter or GitHub or Google and talk about like how do you manage that first account creation process to make sure you're validating. We touched on it a little last night about creating new Facebook accounts now requires like an ID and a picture and all this stuff. How do you balance that with making it easy for users to create accounts, but then also how do you deal with the once they delete it? If you're weak in all those areas and it's easy to create a new account and easy to delete an account, you could start eating up a lot of namespace, and that could potentially become problematic. I'm not sure though. I'd like to bring someone on and talk about that. I think it's fascinating.
Absolutely, and especially because we've seen things like domain squatting, right? Like it's similar to
Yeah.
like maybe user handle squatting
Hmm.
as another example, and especially if you've deleted an account and it's able to be re-registered at a later time without any sort of vetting process. Like if I accidentally delete an account, which by the way shouldn't really be easy to do to begin with, but if I accidentally deleted an account, recovery should be an option for me, but there should be a rigorous validating process that takes
Hmm.
place before that is able to be returned to me in some fashion.
Right.
So moving on, because I know that we're somewhat limited for time, I wanted to highlight, speaking of kind of code gone awry, I don't know if you caught the UK government websites who were actually serving up crypto mining software through a common package called Browse Aloud, which I thought was very interesting. Paul, did you get a chance to see this at all?
I haven't. No, I know that this is becoming more of a trend, which is kind of interesting on multiple fronts, right? So the Salon website that offered you that choice between like, hey, you can run your ad blocker, that's fine, but if you do, you got to help us mine some cryptocurrency, which I think is just poor choices. And then municipalities tend, I think, over time, doing these shows for now our 14th year, it seems to be a trend that uh, city and local state governments don't have the resources to properly secure their stuff due to all different kinds of funding. And different states have different funding issues. But for an example of it going really bad, kind of similar to here, is in Washington State where marijuana is legal. Their registration for the transportation and registration of who's growing and transporting marijuana in the state, they broke into that database, but they didn't steal the PII of the people who are registered. They stole the data that was related to when shipments would be happening, date and time, and where they would be going to and from. Obviously, to potentially hijack a shipment if you know where the shipments are going to be. I thought that was really interesting. They didn't even care about the PII, which could be problematic in and of itself. They only cared about attacking the shipments. So those are just two stories that came to mind when I read this one from Wired.
And the way that I look at these is this is kind of like a supply chain attack or a watering hole attack,
Mhm.
where if you poison just one package, the impact is huge. And in fact, I remember, I think it was a few episodes back now, Paul, there was that kind of fictional event that someone wrote where they had effectively poisoned an NPM package that got pulled into other NPM packages. This is kind of a similar story of a different kind where someone was able to break into BrowseAloud, and instead of stealing, data or any of that other stuff, they simply injected malicious code into the library that was being pulled down everywhere else and let it run crypto mining software, which is in itself, it's like, how do you deal with a situation where you can't trust the supplier of code if like it's used all over the place? So it's again maybe checking that you have local versions, seeing what has changed, doing all sorts of good internal practices for file integrity checking and code signing. before you actually pull down and start using these things live in production.
The scary part for
which
me,
is
Keith, is that companies that it's critical to their business to create software and allow people to use their software, I think are better poised than ever and certainly have more tools and techniques and processes available to make that software more secure than ever before. I mean, we talked about the DevOps process and Docker and all of these different points in which the SDLC can certainly benefit from security, including, we already talked about how to verify kind of third-party sources, third-party APIs we've touched on before as well. However, when you're a municipality, your goal in life is not to create and use and secure software, and this is where attackers, I think, are going to have a field day for quite some time when it's not your mission to deploy this software or secure the software. That can be problematic, and your implementation could further weaken some of the security controls that may have been put in place by the vendor, or maybe you have an internal development team that's helping with that. And I just feel like municipalities especially are just not in a good position to do all of those things. Hopefully over time that process gets easier, right? And it trickles down. I think we saw that with Microsoft over the past 15 or 20 years. Certainly they cleaned a whole bunch of stuff up in their security processes, and it served as a model, and it started to trickle down. But I think we're a ways away for some of the smaller organizations whose goal it is not to produce software, but to some other kind of goal and actually apply software security.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea of trusting trust. You have to trust somewhere at some point in your line of building code or pulling in code, whether it's the compiler or the libraries that you're pulling in for a front-end web platform of some kind, right? So to this end, it's really putting the onus back on those producers of the code that is used broadly to make sure that you're doing everything you can to secure access to your code base, to make sure that it is securely updated and that you can monitor those updates to that code base for the right people doing that sort of thing at the right time. I can only imagine that two-factor authentication should be really used everywhere for anybody that's doing any sort of code changes or has control over code used across a variety of different applications.
Yeah, I think that helps. I mean, that can also still be very much circumvented and certainly not a silver bullet. There's just a lot of moving parts. I mean, Chrome is a prime example. You've got Google trying to secure the platform in various different ways. You've got end users that are just downloading all of these extensions willy-nilly, and there's no verification process on the end user to really help them. And then you've got people who are developing those extensions that are either developing vulnerable extensions or getting pwned, and someone else is putting code inside their extensions, which is going in the platform. Google doesn't catch everything, so malicious extensions end up in there, and then the user doesn't have, in my opinion, very good tools to identify a malicious extension once it gets into Chrome. It's a similar kind of problem when you're building an application. You're building in your Lego blocks, and you have a similar kind of problem. Except a lot of times you don't have Google helping you secure the platform because you're using like WordPress, which is a really bad example of, or a really good example of something really vulnerable that has a similar process of plugins and a platform and the user validation issues.
And makes up something like 15% of the internet, by the way. Just think about that for a minute, how big the internet is. Speaking of Google, and in this case also Facebook, interestingly, I wanted to jump to story number 5 under the section for if you build it, they will come. So Unilever, which has an ad budget of $9.8 billion, 25% of which are used on digital ads, is telling Facebook and Google to clean up or they're pulling ads, which I thought was really, really a huge move by Unilever, because they basically said, look, you guys are promoting fake news, racism, sexism, and extremism. And quite frankly, unless you clean up, we're taking our money elsewhere. That is absolutely huge. And to me, speaks volumes. What do you think about that story, Paul?
It explains the story I read this week where Google's going to take a stronger stance on ad blocking inside of Chrome. And now I think I understand what fueled it as well. I also think that, of course, Facebook has come under scrutiny, with the Russians taking out ads to try and impact the election. I think there's still fallout from that as well. Facebook and Google have the toughest time with this problem because they have it at such a massive scale across multiple properties that are in and of itself, even their sub-properties like Google's YouTube and Facebook's Instagram, have this problem 10, 20 fold above and beyond other companies. So this is going to be an interesting one to watch.
For sure. And especially with, there have been a number of stories lately about kind of the internal struggles and changes that have been taking place at Facebook over the last 2 years, just as a result of everything that happened with the election. So
Yep.
It'll be very interesting to see how the cultures inside of the organizations change, as well as the sort of functionality and kind of the way in which they approach this problem going forward. Paul, if we have time, I did want to cover one more story related to WordPress that I thought you might find interesting.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Amazon has actually recently launched a plugin for WordPress called Poly that turns blog posts into audio, including podcasts. So what they actually did is they launched a WordPress plugin that has, I believe, something like 47 male and female voices supported in 24 different languages that effectively can take your WordPress blog posts and turn them into a Polycast podcast on Amazon. Which I thought was really interesting. What are your thoughts there, Paul, especially given that it's in WordPress?
Yeah, I think it's just interesting from a user perspective. I mean, I listen to most of my books, and I start to wonder, like, when you write, do you have to write in a certain way so that the spoken audio is easily consumable by the human ear and the human brain? I think it would be kind of interesting, though, if that wasn't too awkward, to be able to listen to my blog posts just like podcasts. I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know. I think it's better the other way, to be honest with you, to take the spoken word and turn it into a transcript. Which, stay tuned for more on that. But I think that's pretty interesting.
And for me, I think that what is lost in translation as a result of a blog versus spoken word, for example, is you and I both use ums and ahs and other pauses in the way in which we say things that gives it certain character. It really makes it ours, right? And so to that end, I wonder if that sort of, experience will change as a result of users leveraging this plugin to take their blogs, which are written for prose and for consumption visually, into some sort of spoken word, especially given the number of languages and dialects that they have this in.
And I think so many, blog posts that we read are somewhat technical in nature too, or rely, like you said, on that visual aspect, have a diagram or some kind of picture that is reinforcing the visual. Translating that into audio doesn't necessarily make sense.
No, especially when you're trying to describe something. Whiteboards, the reason that they're so ubiquitous inside of the development world and even in sometimes security space is for the effectiveness of the visual aspects that they bring that is not easily translated into spoken word.
What I would love, and I actually heard, This Week in Tech on the Twit Network talk about this years ago, and I don't think any of this technology has caught on. It'd be interesting from an application perspective to understand some of the challenges. But, like even here in Security Weekly, we've got audio content, we've got video content, and now we're going to have some written content, more structured written content. How do you consume all that? I mean, not at once, but present all of that so that you can listen, you can watch, or you can read, and you can bounce back and forth between all those different mediums, on your tablet or your phone or something like that. I think that would be really cool technology. I'm sure there are people working on it. I'm not sure. Nothing like mainstream or anything that I've ever seen has come close to doing that. So,
yeah, that unified experience of consumption is. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see Google and Facebook ironically move to that realm in some way, because that's really what they are. Is they're built for consumption.
Right.
Cool. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.